Today on Searching for the Soul of America, we're going to go back in time when Kentucky was a dark and dangerous place. We're going to look at the life of pioneers that first came over, and we're going to look at a revival that happened right here in the state of Kentucky that not only changed the state, but began to flow throughout the United States. So don't go away. It was one of those first beautiful days of the year. It was a day my son-in-law had to go to work, and my granddaughter, she went to a birthday party. So my grandson talked his mother into taking him on a hike. Well, there's some hiking trails close to their house. So she said, okay, I'll take you. But we're not going to be gone very long. We'll stay on the short trail. Well, ended up, they were on the long trail and they were lost. And daylight was burning. And she had about an hour of daylight left before they could get out, and she had no clue where they were at. So she did have some cell phone service. So she called us and she said, I'm really concerned that we're going to be caught back here in the dark. She said, there is a couple that's hiking up behind us, about 150 feet behind us. And she said, I'm going to let them catch up and then we will follow them out because they probably know where they're going. Well, eventually she called back and my wife asked her, said, well, did this couple know the way out? She said, no. She said, they were following us because they were lost and they thought we knew the way out. Well, when I tell that story, I think about how the first pioneers came to Kentucky. Kentucky being nothing but wilderness, and there's even stories of valleys that had grass and brush grown up so tall that you could even get lost even in the valley. Now think about these pioneers that would come over and only packing what they needed. They couldn't pack excessive material. They had to pack what they needed. And they're going into a place that they've never been before. It's amazing that some of us can get lost on a hiking trail, and these people came from many through the Cumberland Gap and came into Kentucky. Eventually, as they kept coming through, they were able to build a couple forts. And the first two forts that were built were Fort Herod and then Fort Boonesborough. And this was great places to have for them to bring their wives and their children in, because there many times was hostile attacks, Indians, there were wild animals, there were stories of panthers, cougars, bears, and so they could bring their wives over and live in these forts. Now, during this study, I come across who the first school teacher was. And I thought this was interesting. It was at Fort Herod. They came across this young lady. Her name was Jane Coombs, and she came from Maryland. She was a young Catholic lady. So she was the first school teacher that came to Kentucky. And when she came in, they were very proud to have her because she was a skilled teacher. Now think about this. Being skilled, there's no Office Depot, there's no Walmart back-to-school specials. Jane Coombs was skilled because she knew how to take trees and make ink from stains that come from trees, and she would take a board and write out the alphabet. And I seen one of these boards that was it's called a horn book, and it had the alphabet written on it, and it actually had the Lord's Prayer that was written on it. And Jane Coombs was able to teach them how to read and write. And of course, after they learned to read and write, one of the main books that they would have would be the Bible, and there were hymnals that they would could be able to read from. Now, the people of Harrodsburg couldn't pay her very much, and they were all poor, but they paid what they could, and they built her a little one-room log cabin for the schoolhouse. So this was the first schoolhouse and the first school teacher that came to Kentucky. So we're going to go to Randy King. He's a friend of ours that we met, and Randy does a great job portraying the life of a Kentucky long hunter.
The items that you see here and what I attempt to portray is some of the first people that set foot into Kentucky. The Daniel Boones, the Simon Kentons, the George Rogers Clarks. We came to this country in approximately 1750. Dr. Thomas Walker was one of the first men recorded into the state of Kentucky. And in the 4 months that he was here, he killed approximately 12 deer, 13 elk, 11 buffalo, and 150 turkeys. Now, if we were going to kill that much game, we're going to have a fire to cook it on, and this is the way we started our fires. Flint and steel, it's been known for thousands of years, creates a spark. We carried fire starting kits with us, usually had 1 or 2. The last thing that you wanted to do was be caught here without any means of fire. I'll attempt to start one now. Every time you stopped to eat a meal, you went through this process. Some of the items that you see here on the blanket in front of me is the items that we would have carried. They were carried in basically a long hunter's briefcase. It's known as a portmanteau. This was what you usually carried personal items with. Cleanliness. Believe it or not, we had to try to stay healthy. Lye soap was the predominant soap at that time. Part of my medical kit. This is a mole that I had caught. We would take and save this skin to use in your moccasins in case you got a blister. You would cover a blister with it. Another item, a mirror. It's something simple you don't really think about, but we could trade these to the Indians. Can you imagine going your whole life and never seeing a reflection of yourself, never knowing what you looked like? We would use them for signaling back and forth between ridge tops. Your pipe. This was probably one of the reasons that we came into Kentucky too. Along the East Coast in 1775, there's 4 million people. Land has become scarce for the common working man. The ground that was under cultivation was being used to raise tobacco, which depleted the soils. They didn't have the knowledge how to build the soil back up, so their solution was to move on and find new ground. So tobacco was one of the causes of the immigration. Journals. Most of us would keep journals of things we'd seen, streams that could be blocked and used for mills, stands of timber, bottom grounds. Most long hunters were illiterate. Boone could barely sign his name. Simon Kenton was a little bit better, could read and write. But usually out of a party of 4, at least one man could read, and the Bible was usually one of the items that they would carry with them to be read out of at nighttime. When you stop and ask yourself, why does Kentucky have more animals than, say, Indiana or Tennessee? It was because of salt. Kentucky had an overabundance of salt springs. All animals crave salt. As a long hunter, all I had to do was find a good salt spring, and I could kill as many animals as I possibly could ever care to. There's records of men killing 2,500 deer in one season. Those furs were either packed back across the mountains or loaded onto canoes and taken down to New Orleans. Pair of dice. If you were sitting around camp with 3 other guys at nighttime, usually you would want some form of entertainment. They played dice games. Needles. You always carried needles with you because moccasins were notorious for wearing out, and that was part of your nightly ritual, was to repair your shoe wear.
After the French and Indian War came the proclamation of 1763. Now, the French and Indian War lasted about 7 years, and the British did not want any more conflicts with Indians or with the French. So if you look at a map of that day, you'll see the 13 colonies lined up and down on the east coast of America. And then just to the west is the Appalachian Mountains. Now the mountains, they look like kind of like a natural barricade, if you will, or a natural fence. And so the British said, from now on, you can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now this angered a lot of people, especially those that were long hunters, because it was keeping them from venturing into Kentucky. And a lot of people had plans of moving to Kentucky, but this dampened it. Some broke the law and some obeyed it. But anyway, it was the proclamation of 1763. Well, after that, then the relationship between the colonists and Britain began to deteriorate. In 1774, then there was the First Continental Congress that met, and their discussion was the winds of war. We were going to have to fight if we were to win the independence that we so desired. And it was then that it was brought up, should we go before God in prayer? Now some thought maybe we shouldn't, because it could be that if you got somebody that was Anglican, it might offend somebody that's Dutch Reformed, and so on. Even though they were all of the Christian faith, most of them, that it could offend somebody. But Samuel Adams thundered these words that I think is something that we need to listen to today. He said, I'm no bigot. I can hear the prayer of any man, as long as he's pious, and at the same time, he has a love for this country. It was then that John Adams, his cousin, went out and he found Reverend Jacob Deshay. Now, Reverend Jacob Deshay came in and he was going to lead them in prayer. But his daily Bible reading that day was Psalms 35. So he opens his Bible and begins to read Psalms 35. And in Psalms 35, David is crying out to the Lord to deliver me, Lord, from my enemies. Bring them to shame and confuse them. And it's a cry of deliverance. Well, this really touched the forefathers. Now in my Bible, I got Psalms 35 and I wrote over it U.S. history. So I'm going to ask you, will you, after watching this, will you get your Bible out and read Psalms 35? Because it's a part of American history. Well, after Jacob Deshay read this, then he broke into prayer. And it was a beautiful prayer, and it inspired our forefathers. And John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, and he said, Abigail, I implore you, you must read Psalms 35. Well, a few months later, Patrick Henry stood up in St. John's Church, and he gave the famous speech, give me liberty or give me death. This speech inspired so many people, and one of the people that was inspired that day was Reverend John Peter Muhlenberg. He was a pastor, he was a young man, he was a pastor of a church, and it inspired him so much that he went to General Washington and he signed up with the Continental Army. Now we got a problem here. He's also a pastor. So how is he going to tell his congregation that your beloved pastor has joined the army? Well, it came on a Sunday morning. He stood up in the congregation. He had on his robe, and he read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it's the chapter of times and seasons. There's a time to sow, there's a time to reap. And then John Peter Muhlenberg said, we are in a time of war. And he undone his clerical robe, and there before his congregation, he had on a Continental officer's uniform. And he asked the men, he goes, who's with me? And many of the men in the church stood up. They reached over and kissed their wife and their children goodbye. And John Peter Muhlenberg was able to ride out with 300 men to join up with George Washington. Now, a little bit later, they were in Valley Forge, and this was the worst time known in the American Revolution. Estimates are that they came in with 11,000 troops, and before they left, it was down to 6,000. There were some that deserted, but many of them were dying. At one rate, it was 12 men a day were dying. And what a disastrous time. They didn't have a lot of clothes, and they didn't have blankets, adequate clothes for a winter camp, and they were actually hiding from the British. Well, one of those there was Captain Henry Rhodes, who served under John Peter Muhlenberg. And he was known for packing his German Bible. He loved his Bible that he packed. Toward the end of Valley Forge, just as they were going out, they're going to have to go out and fight the British. They're well trained now, and they were very hardened. They were ready for battle. Captain Henry Rhodes took 128 pages of his Bible. He tore them out so that they could use them for patching in their muskets. So he donates his Bible for the war. As Kentucky began to grow and more people came in, some were noting that Kentucky was a bushwhacking state. There were people like the Hart brothers that came in. It was Big Harp and Little Harp, and they terrorized the state of Kentucky. They were actually killing people, even people that was helping them. They were just a murderous band of people that come over. So Kentucky was really a dangerous place, but something was going to change. There was a pastor by the name of James McCready, and he took his congregation and they decided that every third Saturday they would pray and they would fast for a move of God that would come to the state of Kentucky. Well, eventually it happened. And after their being faithful to prayer, that a move of God happened, and it was part of what is called the Second Great Awakening that happened here in the state of Kentucky. Now, one of the largest cities in Kentucky was known for having about 2,000 people. So the state is actually starting to grow. At the time of the American Revolution, Kentucky had probably about 200 people. So Kentucky's starting to grow. But picture this, when this revival hit, it was known for having 20 to 25,000 people coming to this place. And the revival broke among the common people. You know, there's a scripture that says in Mark chapter 12 that the common people gladly heard Jesus. Well, the common people were gladly hearing a message that led to a great revival. When from this revival, there also came what was called circuit riders. And these were Baptist and Methodist ministers that would get on their horse and they would ride horseback from churches to church preaching the gospel. And when they would get to a church, if there was somebody that needed baptizing, if there was a young couple that was going to get married, they would perform these services. And you know, they did it without money. They did it without asking for pay. I was reading some of the notes of these pastors that were on horseback, circuit riders, such as Francis Asbury, Peter Cartwright, that they baptized thousands of people, that they preached thousands of sermons, and here they are on horseback doing all this work, no Motel 6s. And so from in between church to church, they would sometimes get caught in snowstorms and rain, and life was really rough. Well, we went to a pioneer village, and it was Pioneer Days in Spencer County. And it was there that we caught up with Kurt Songer, who portrays a circuit rider, and he's going to tell us what life was like back in the early 1800s for a circuit rider.
Well, the life of a circuit rider back in the early 1700s, all the way up to the 1800s, it wasn't an easy life. It was a rough life. They spent all their time pretty much on horseback. They traveled just with the clothes on their back and their books, what they had to have to do their services and what have you. Relied on the people at each settlement when they get there to house him, feed him, take care of him. If he needed repairs of clothing or something, they would try to take care of him in that way until they done with what time he was there, and then he would move on to the next one. Of course, back in that time period, if you stop and think, they still had wild animals that he had to deal with on the road. Still in this area, we still had cougars, lions, bears. So he had a lot of wildlife he had to deal with, dangerous wildlife. And we also still had Indians in the area, something that he had to be on a constant watch out. Great deal of them, and I would say probably, I would think most of them still carried a firearm with them because they had to have some kind of protection. And he had to supply what food, if his food run out before he got to the next settlement, he had to have a way of supplying himself with meat. So most of them were armed when they traveled, but a great deal of them never lived past 30 because of the rough life it was out on the frontier. If you think about the people who actually live in the settlements, you know, they don't travel as much. They do most of their living right there in that settlement. They may go out for 2 or 3 days like the hunters would, but he spent his whole time on horseback traveling in his circuit, which oftentimes the circuit would take him 4 to 5 weeks to complete before it would start over again. Usually when he got to the settlement, wherever he was headed, they would put the people in the church or people in the settlement, or if they had a church building, which most of them didn't, if they had a church building, it served as a church, it served as a schoolhouse, it would serve as an inn for travelers. And while he was there, they would either put him up in there or the neighboring people would put him up the short time he's there. He may be there just a couple of days, he may be there a week, because a lot of them, if they had baptisms, usually always had the sacrament services that would be saved up for when the minister got there. And then he would take care of all the weddings, any baptisms, whatever needed to be done until he moved on to the next one. In my opinion, they was probably some of the most dedicated people to what they were doing, dedicated to serving God and the way he called them to serve. Because of the hard life, it was not a well-paid job. Matter of fact, most of them, especially in the early part of the years, never made nothing on it. They was just sent out to do, just like Christ sent out the apostles to preach. He told them, just take what you got with you and let them supply you with everything else. And that's pretty much the way the circuit riders did it for a long time. Later in years, after you got up in the 1800, they were supplemented in income. I think, if I remember right, a single minister would make $80 a year. If he was a married man, he would make $160 a year. So as you can see, he didn't make a lot of money doing it. And a lot of them would have a second profession as well to help support themselves. Whether they was farmers, blacksmith, just about reed chairs, repair, carpentry work. Most of them all had a second profession because it was not a way to make a living as far as making a living. It was just about serving his Lord. Oh, Francis Asbury, in his lifetime of his ministry as a circuit rider, he traveled over 270,000 miles on horseback and preached over 16,000 sermons. Now, if you try to, in nowadays age, putting that in some kind of perspective, it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around. Because that means at 270 miles on horseback, he had to spend almost his entire life riding on horseback from town to town, spreading the word of God. To me, Francis Asbury was just, if you want to call it, the top dog, really, in his profession of a circuit riding minister, because, I mean, he endured a lot to serve his Lord.
So today, on Searching for the Soul of America, we started out when Kentucky was a wilderness and the first pioneers that came over, such as Daniel Boone. We looked at what happened during the proclamation of 1763 that led up to the war of our independence. Patrick Henry, who stated, "Give me liberty or give me death," that inspired John Peter Muhlenberg, who preached in his sermon, his church. Then Captain Henry Rhodes, who was given land and came to Kentucky. And then a revival that broke out because people dedicated themselves to prayer. I want to ask you, could that happen again? If we decided that we would pray, could we change things that are happening? America needs prayer. Our state needs prayer. And we're asking you, would you join us in prayer? Hope that you enjoyed this, and God bless you. Until the next time, we'll be searching for the soul of America.